"Sir, if you sign that, you might not own this company tomorrow." The words came softly, almost lost beneath the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint clink of crystal glasses being gathered from the long walnut conference table. Jonathan Whitmore's pen hovered just above the final page of the contract, the black ink tip trembling slightly in the reflected morning light pouring through the 30-foot floor-to-ceiling windows. For a moment, no one moved. Then a few executives turned, their expressions shifting from concentration to confusion as they tried to locate the source of the interruption. Standing near the side wall, beside a stainless steel cart holding a spray bottle and folded microfiber cloths, was Daniel Brooks. His Navy janitor uniform was crisp but simple, his name stitched in white thread above his chest pocket. One hand rested lightly on the cart handle, the other held a neatly folded cloth. He wasn't supposed to speak. He wasn't supposed to exist in this room beyond quiet footsteps and polished surfaces. A soft chuckle broke the silence. One of the board members leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting his cufflinks. Did the janitor just interrupt a $400 million deal? A few others smiled politely, not cruelly, but dismissively, like adults humoring a child who wandered into the wrong place. Jonathan Whitmore didn't smile. His silver-streaked hair caught the sunlight, his jaw set in calm authority. He slowly lowered his pen, but didn't look at Daniel yet. Instead, he tapped the paper once, thoughtful, controlled. "What did you say?" he asked without raising his voice. Daniel stepped forward just half a pace, careful, respectful. The marble floor reflected the overhead lights beneath his worn but clean shoes. "Page 18, sir," Daniel said quietly. Second paragraph under liability restructuring. The room shifted again, this time less amused. A woman from legal frowned slightly, flipping through her printed copy. Another executive exchanged a glance with the CFO. "Sir, we've had 3 law firms review this," someone said calmly. But there was a hint of tension beneath the professionalism. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded once, then lowered his gaze slightly, as if ready to step back into invisibility the moment he was dismissed. Outside the glass wall, the skyline shimmered in the late morning sun, traffic moving silently 30 floors below. Inside, the temperature felt suddenly cooler, the air heavier. Jonathan Whitmore finally turned his head. His eyes settled on Daniel, studying him, not with irritation, but with curiosity. Daniel stood still, hands relaxed, posture calm. No challenge. No arrogance. Just quiet certainty. Jonathan flipped to page 18. The faint sound of paper sliding across polished wood echoed through the room. One by one, other executives followed. The soft rustle of documents replaced the earlier confidence. A lawyer leaned forward, brow tightening. The CFO adjusted his glasses. The woman from legal stopped mid-page, her finger pausing over a line. Jonathan Whitmore's expression didn't change, but his pen lowered slowly onto the table. And just like that, the boardroom fell silent. Daniel Brooks had not planned to speak that morning. He had arrived at 6:15, as he did every weekday, pushing his cart across the quiet marble lobby while the city outside was still waking up. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, the kind brewed early for executives who preferred to start before the markets opened. Daniel liked those hours. No questions. No eyes following him. Just the soft hum of elevators and the distant glow of sunrise creeping between the towers across the street. He moved methodically, wiping fingerprints from the glass railings, aligning chairs in the executive lounge, straightening magazines that no one ever seemed to read. His motions were calm, practiced, almost invisible. Most people never noticed him, and that was fine. Invisible meant peaceful. At 6:45, he passed the reception desk where a small digital screen displayed the day's schedule. Board meeting. 8:30. Acquisition review. Whitmore Holdings. Daniel slowed for a second, not long enough for anyone to notice, but long enough for his eyes to register the words. He continued walking, guiding the cart toward the private elevator reserved for executive floors. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor took less than 20 seconds, but it always felt longer. The mirrored walls reflected his uniform, his steady expression, the quiet weight he carried in his thoughts. When the doors opened, the hallway greeted him with silence and sunlight stretching across the polished stone like a pale river. He began his routine, starting with the outer offices, wiping desks, emptying bins, moving with the same careful rhythm he had learned years ago. Daniel had always paid attention to details. Small things mattered. A misplaced number. A missing word. A sentence that changed meaning depending on how it was written. He had learned that long before this job, long before the uniform, back when his mornings started with spreadsheets instead of cleaning carts and conference rooms instead of corridors. At 8:20, he entered the boardroom to prepare the space. The long walnut table reflected the skyline outside. Leather chairs were perfectly aligned, water bottles placed at equal distances, notepads centered with precision. Daniel moved quietly, wiping a faint ring left by an earlier meeting, adjusting a chair by less than an inch, making sure the room felt ready before anyone arrived. That was when he noticed the folder. It sat near the head of the table, slightly open, a stack of printed documents marked with bold lettering. Acquisition agreement. Daniel did not intend to read it. He never touched executive materials. But as he adjusted the water glasses, a page shifted, and a paragraph near the bottom caught his eye. Just a glance. Just a line. He paused. The wording felt familiar, structured in a way that pulled at his memory. He read it again, quietly, without touching the paper. The liability clause transferred conditional responsibility under restructuring contingencies. It was subtle, carefully phrased, easy to overlook. Daniel stepped back slowly, the faint hum of the city outside filling the silence. He looked at the skyline, then back at the document. For a moment, he considered walking away. That would have been easier. Invisible again, quiet again. But something inside him stayed still, like a compass refusing to turn. Minutes later, executives began entering the room, voices low, confident, discussing numbers and projections. Daniel moved to the side wall, hands resting lightly on his cart, watching the meeting begin. He told himself he would leave after finishing the last glass. Then Jonathan Whitmore lifted his pen, and Daniel spoke. Jonathan Whitmore kept his eyes on the document, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. The quiet confidence that had filled the boardroom minutes earlier had thinned into something more cautious, more deliberate. The woman from legal cleared her throat softly, leaning forward as her finger traced the paragraph Daniel had mentioned. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses, reading the clause once, then again, slower the second time. Across the table, one of the senior partners straightened in his chair, the leather creaking faintly in. The silence. Outside the glass walls, a helicopter drifted slowly between buildings, its distant hum barely audible, but inside the room every sound felt magnified, every movement measured. Daniel remained near the wall, hands resting lightly on the handle of his cart, his expression calm but attentive. He did not step forward again. He did not repeat himself. He simply waited, as if the truth did not require volume, only time. Jonathan Whitmore flipped the page back, then forward again, scanning the wording with careful precision. His posture remained composed, but his pen no longer rested in his hand. Instead, it lay motionless beside the contract, forgotten for the moment. This restructuring clause, the chief financial officer said quietly, his voice controlled, appears to transfer downstream liability if post-acquisition regulatory adjustments occur. The woman from legal nodded slowly, her brow tightening. It is written to appear conditional, but the language here creates a default responsibility shift. Another executive leaned forward, his earlier confidence fading. Are you saying we would assume full exposure if the valuation adjustments trigger? No one answered immediately. The silence stretched across the table, heavy but not dramatic, the kind that forms when professionals realize something important has changed. Jonathan Whitmore leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. His eyes remained on the document, but his attention sharpened, like a lens coming into focus. Run the scenario, he said calmly. The chief financial officer tapped his tablet, fingers moving quickly across the screen. The faint tapping sound filled the room, followed by the soft glow of projected numbers appearing on the wall display. Graphs shifted, columns recalculated. A few executives leaned closer, studying the emerging projections. Daniel watched quietly, the reflections of moving charts flickering across the polished surface of the conference table. If the clause activates under market adjustment conditions, the chief financial officer continued, his voice steady but more deliberate now. We absorb the liability for operational restructuring costs. He paused, then added, That could exceed $180 million within the first 12 months. A subtle shift passed through the room. No one reacted dramatically. No raised voices. No sudden movements. Just a collective stillness, like a room realizing the ground beneath it had shifted slightly. Jonathan Whitmore nodded once, absorbing the information. He turned another page, reviewing the structure of the agreement, then glanced briefly toward the legal team. Why was this not flagged earlier? He asked, not accusing, just precise. The woman from legal inhaled slowly. It is embedded within a favorable tax adjustment section. The wording is carefully structured. She hesitated, then added, it is easy to interpret as standard language. Jonathan Whitmore leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing slightly in concentration. Outside, sunlight moved across the skyline, casting long reflections across the glass walls. Inside, the atmosphere felt different now, quieter, more attentive. After a moment, Jonathan Whitmore turned his head slightly toward the side wall. His gaze found Daniel again. Daniel stood exactly where he had been, composed, respectful, as if ready to return to polishing glass the moment he was no longer needed. Jonathan Whitmore studied him for a brief second, then looked back at the document. No words were spoken, but the room understood something had shifted. The acquisition had not changed. The numbers had not changed. But the silence now carried a different meaning, and no one reached for a pen. Jonathan Whitmore closed the folder slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, the soft thud echoing gently across the polished table. The projected numbers still glowed faintly on the wall, casting pale reflections across the glass and steel surfaces of the room. No one spoke. The earlier momentum of the meeting had faded into something more cautious, more deliberate. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady as he looked toward the senior partner across from him. We paused the signing, he said calmly. The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. Several executives shifted in their seats, not surprised, but aware that the tone of the meeting had fundamentally changed. The senior partner nodded slowly, closing his own folder. We should request a revision, he replied. The woman from legal gathered her notes, already marking sections that required review. The chief financial officer minimized the projections, the glowing charts fading into a blank screen that reflected the skyline behind them. Outside, sunlight brightened as the morning advanced, illuminating the room with a softer, warmer tone. Inside, the silence felt less tense now, but more reflective. Jonathan Whitmore rested his hands lightly on the table, then turned his head again toward the side of the room. Daniel Brooks remained beside the cleaning cart, still composed, as if he had simply paused mid-task and was waiting for permission to resume. His posture had not changed. His expression remained calm, respectful, almost careful not to draw attention to himself. Jonathan studied him for a moment, his gaze thoughtful rather than curious now. Mr. Brooks, Jonathan said quietly. The use of Daniel's name caused a subtle shift in the room. A few executives glanced toward Daniel, some with mild surprise, others with quiet recognition. Daniel straightened slightly, not rigid, just attentive. Yes, sir, he replied gently. Jonathan gestured toward the document. How did you notice the clause? The question hung in the air, not confrontational, but genuine. Daniel hesitated for just a second, choosing his words carefully. The structure, sir, he said softly. It is written inside a benefits section, but the wording changes the responsibility if the adjustment triggers. It felt familiar. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing the explanation. The woman from legal glanced at Daniel again, her expression now thoughtful instead of dismissive. One of the executives leaned back slightly, folding his arms as he observed Daniel with a new level of attention. Have you worked in finance before? Jonathan asked, his tone even. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up with quiet honesty. Yes, sir. A few years ago. The room remained silent, but the atmosphere shifted again, subtle but noticeable. Jonathan Whitmore studied Daniel for another moment, then nodded once more, as if placing a piece into a larger picture. Thank you, he said simply. Daniel inclined his head gently, then reached for the microfiber cloth on his cart. Without drawing attention, he stepped toward the far end of the table and began wiping a faint watermark left by a glass, his movements smooth and practiced, as though nothing unusual had happened. The executives watched for a second, then returned to their documents. But the quiet respect in the room remained. Outside the windows, sunlight stretched further across the city, reflecting off distant buildings. Inside the boardroom, the meeting resumed, slower now, more careful, and Daniel Brooks, standing beside the long walnut table, continued polishing the surface until it reflected the morning light like still water. The meeting resumed, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations that once moved quickly now slowed into careful exchanges, each executive reviewing language with sharper attention. Papers shifted quietly. Tablets glowed softly. The long walnut table reflected every small movement like still water disturbed by gentle ripples. Daniel Brooks moved along the far edge of the room, wiping the glass wall where faint fingerprints caught the sunlight. His motions were steady, practiced, almost meditative. He did not look toward the table again, but he remained aware of the shifting tone behind him, the subtle weight that filled the air when professionals realized something nearly overlooked. Jonathan Whitmore listened as the legal team discussed revised terms, his posture composed, fingers lightly resting against the table surface. The skyline beyond the windows stretched across miles of steel and glass, the late morning sun climbing higher, warming the reflections across the room. After several minutes, the chief financial officer spoke again, his voice measured. If we had proceeded under the original structure, the exposure would have increased gradually over the next 3 quarters. It would not have been obvious at first. Another executive nodded slowly. It would have looked like normal operational adjustments. Jonathan Whitmore absorbed the explanation, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. He turned one page of the agreement, then closed the folder again. Then we review every clause, he said calmly. No assumptions. Around the table, heads nodded in quiet agreement. The confidence had returned, but it was different now, grounded in caution instead of momentum. Near the wall, Daniel finished wiping the glass and returned to his cart, folding the cloth with careful precision. The soft sound of fabric sliding against fabric barely registered above the quiet conversation. He moved toward the door, intending to leave the room the way he always did, quietly, without drawing attention. As he reached for the handle, Jonathan Whitmore spoke again. Daniel. The room shifted subtly. Daniel paused, turning back with calm attentiveness. Yes, sir. Jonathan leaned slightly forward, studying him with composed interest. You mentioned the wording felt familiar. Daniel nodded gently. Yes, sir. Jonathan rested his hands together. Where did you learn to recognize structures like that? The question carried no pressure, only curiosity. Daniel considered for a moment before answering. I worked as a junior analyst after college, he said quietly, mostly reviewing agreements and identifying risk patterns. A faint ripple of surprise moved across the room, subtle but noticeable. One executive glanced toward another. The woman from legal tilted her head slightly, reassessing. Jonathan Whitmore nodded slowly. What changed? He asked. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, then met Jonathan's eyes again with quiet steadiness. My father became ill, sir. I stepped away to take care of him. After he passed, the position was gone. This job was available. The explanation was simple, without embellishment. No apology, no bitterness, just fact. The room grew still again, not tense, but reflective. Jonathan Whitmore nodded once more, absorbing the quiet dignity in Daniel's words. Understood, he said gently. Daniel inclined his head, then turned back toward the door. He pushed the cart forward, the wheels rolling softly across the polished marble floor. As he stepped into the hallway, the sound of the meeting resumed behind him, but the tone remained changed, more deliberate, more thoughtful. Daniel guided the cart toward the elevator, the sunlight from the windows stretching across the corridor like a quiet path. He pressed the call button and waited, hands resting lightly on the handle, his reflection faintly visible in the brushed steel doors. Inside the boardroom, Jonathan Whitmore glanced once more toward the closed door, then returned to the agreement, reading each line with measured focus as the morning light continued to brighten the city beyond. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Daniel Brooks guided his cart inside, the polished steel walls reflecting the quiet stillness in his posture. The descent from the executive floor felt slower than usual, the numbers above the door counting down steadily, 32, 31, 30, each digit glowing softly before fading. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the cart handle, his gaze calm, not distracted, just thoughtful. The faint vibration of the elevator beneath his shoes was steady, almost rhythmic, like a quiet heartbeat inside the building. When the doors opened to the service corridor, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The bright skyline was replaced by muted fluorescent lighting and the faint scent of cleaning supplies and fresh linen. Daniel stepped out, pushing the cart forward, wheels rolling softly across the smooth tile floor. Down the hallway, another custodian nodded in greeting, and Daniel returned the gesture with a gentle smile. The world here moved differently, slower, quieter, disconnected from the polished confidence of the boardroom above. He parked the cart beside a storage closet and carefully replaced the microfiber cloth, folding it with the same precision he used for everything. The simple routine grounded him, returning him to familiar motion. A moment later, he filled a spray bottle at the utility sink, the sound of running water echoing gently in. The small space. Sunlight filtered faintly through a narrow window near the ceiling, casting a pale strip of light across the tiled wall. Daniel watched the light for a moment, then tightened the cap on the bottle and returned to his cart. Upstairs, the boardroom meeting continued, but Jonathan Whitmore found his attention drifting briefly toward the earlier moment. The legal team discussed revised language, but Jonathan's eyes rested on the empty space near the sidewall where Daniel had stood. The quiet confidence of the janitor's voice still lingered in his memory, calm and measured, without urgency, without pride. Jonathan leaned back slightly, fingers resting together as he listened, but his thoughts moved beyond the numbers and clauses, toward the quiet dignity he had observed. Outside the windows, sunlight now stretched across the glass towers, reflecting bright patterns across the conference table. The chief financial officer spoke again, outlining alternative structures, and Jonathan nodded, returning his attention to the present. Yet the atmosphere remained reflective, as if the morning had introduced something unexpected, something subtle but meaningful. Downstairs, Daniel guided his cart into the lobby, where the midday light streamed through the tall entrance windows. A few visitors crossed the marble floor, their footsteps echoing softly in the spacious atrium. Daniel wiped a glass panel near the reception desk, moving slowly, methodically, the cloth gliding across the surface until it reflected the sunlight like still water. The building continued its quiet rhythm around him, elevators opening and closing, muted conversations drifting through the air, distant traffic humming beyond the glass. Daniel finished wiping the panel and stepped back, checking the reflection, ensuring every detail was clean. He adjusted the cart handle and moved toward the next section, his pace steady, his presence quiet. Above him, 30 floors higher, the meeting moved forward with renewed caution, while below, Daniel Brooks continued his work, unnoticed by most, yet carrying the same calm focus that had changed the course of the morning without raising his voice. Jonathan Whitmore finally closed the revised document and leaned back in his chair, the meeting nearing its conclusion, but the atmosphere remained unusually thoughtful. The legal team gathered their notes, and the chief financial officer summarized the adjusted risk projections with measured clarity. Outside the windows, the late morning sun had shifted toward noon, casting brighter reflections across the glass walls and the polished table. Jonathan listened quietly, then nodded once. "We will reconvene after revisions," he said calmly. Chairs moved softly as executives began standing, their conversations quieter than before, more deliberate. One by one, they exited the boardroom, leaving behind the faint scent of coffee and polished wood. Jonathan remained seated for a moment, his gaze drifting again toward the sidewall where Daniel had stood earlier. The empty space seemed to hold a quiet memory of the morning. He rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the windows, looking out across the city stretching miles into the distance. Cars moved like small streams below, and sunlight reflected off distant rooftops. Jonathan exhaled slowly, then turned and stepped toward the door. The hallway outside felt calmer now, the usual rhythm of the executive floor returning. Assistants walked past with tablets, muted conversations resumed, and phones vibrated softly on desks. Jonathan walked toward the private elevator, but before pressing the button, he paused, considering something quietly. Then he turned and pressed the general elevator instead. The ride down was smooth and quiet, the numbers descending steadily. Jonathan stood with his hands lightly folded, his reflection calm in the brushed steel walls. When the doors opened to the lobby level, the brightness of midday greeted him. The tall glass windows filled the space with sunlight, and the marble floor reflected the movement of visitors and staff. Jonathan stepped forward, scanning the lobby with quiet focus. Near the reception desk, Daniel Brooks moved slowly along a glass partition, wiping the surface with careful, steady motions. His cart stood nearby, neatly organized, every cloth folded, every bottle aligned. Daniel stepped back slightly, examining the reflection, ensuring the glass was clear. Jonathan approached at an unhurried pace, his footsteps soft against the marble. A few employees noticed him passing, offering polite greetings, but Jonathan kept his attention forward. Daniel finished wiping the glass and reached for the next cloth when he sensed someone nearby. He turned gently and saw Jonathan Whitmore standing a few feet away. Daniel straightened slightly, respectful but calm. "Sir," he said quietly. Jonathan studied him for a brief moment, the lobby sunlight reflecting softly across Daniel's uniform. "You noticed something this morning that several experienced professionals did not," Jonathan said, his tone measured and sincere. Daniel shook his head slightly. "I just recognized the wording, sir." Jonathan nodded, absorbing the humility in the response. Around them, the lobby continued its quiet movement, footsteps echoing softly, elevator chimes sounding faintly. "Still," Jonathan replied gently, "it changed the direction of an important decision." Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, then met Jonathan's eyes again. "I am glad I spoke, sir." Jonathan gave a small nod, thoughtful, then glanced briefly at the polished glass Daniel had just cleaned, the sunlight reflecting across it like calm water. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them felt steady, respectful, and then Jonathan Whitmore extended his hand slightly, not formally, but naturally, acknowledging the quiet moment that had reshaped the morning. Daniel looked at the extended hand for a brief moment, not surprised, but quietly reflective, as if measuring the significance of a gesture that did not usually cross the distance between their worlds. Then he reached forward and shook Jonathan Whitmore's hand, his grip steady and respectful. The sunlight from the tall windows washed softly across the marble floor, reflecting upward and illuminating the moment with calm brightness. Around them, the lobby continued its quiet rhythm, visitors passing through glass doors, reception phones ringing softly, elevators chiming in the distance. Jonathan released the handshake slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that situation with composure," he said gently. Daniel nodded once. "I just spoke when it felt necessary, sir." Jonathan studied him again, noticing the calm confidence in Daniel's voice, the absence of pride or expectation. "You mentioned you worked as a junior analyst," Jonathan continued. "How long ago was that?" Daniel rested one hand lightly on the handle of his cart. "About 6 years ago, sir. I worked in risk review for a mid-size investment firm." Jonathan nodded, absorbing the detail. "Do you still follow market developments?" he asked. Daniel allowed a small, modest smile. "I read when I can, sir. Mostly early mornings." Jonathan glanced briefly at the organized cart, the folded cloths, the carefully aligned bottles, then back at Daniel. "That discipline shows," he said quietly. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, acknowledging the comment without responding. The sunlight shifted as clouds passed briefly outside, softening the brightness across the lobby. Jonathan Whitmore placed his hands lightly in his pockets, considering his next words carefully. "We are reviewing additional agreements this week," he said. "If you are comfortable, I would value your perspective on risk language." Informally at first, Daniel blinked once, not startled, but quietly surprised. He did not respond immediately. The invitation hung gently in the air, respectful and unforced. "I appreciate that, sir," Daniel said finally, his voice calm. "I would be glad to help if I can." Jonathan nodded once, satisfied with the simplicity of the answer. A few employees nearby glanced briefly toward them, noticing the conversation but quickly returning to their tasks. The lobby remained calm, the quiet hum of the building continuing uninterrupted. Jonathan Whitmore stepped back slightly, giving Daniel space to return to his work. "Thank you again, Daniel," he said, his tone sincere. Daniel inclined his head gently. "You are welcome, sir." Jonathan turned toward the elevators, His footsteps measured across the marble floor. Daniel watched for a moment, then returned to the glass panel, lifting the cloth and continuing his careful movements. The reflection in the glass showed Jonathan entering the elevator, the doors closing softly behind him. The sunlight brightened again as the clouds passed, illuminating the polished surfaces around Daniel. He finished wiping the glass, stepped back, and checked the reflection, ensuring every detail was clear. The lobby moved quietly around him, unchanged on the surface, yet something subtle had shifted, like light after a passing cloud. Daniel adjusted his cart and moved forward to the next section, his pace steady, his presence calm. While above him the elevator carried Jonathan Whitmore upward, both men returning to their worlds, connected now by a quiet moment of recognition that required no further words. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor, and Jonathan Whitmore stepped out into the quiet corridor, but his pace was slower now, more reflective than before. Assistants moved quietly between offices, and muted conversations drifted through partially open doors, yet Jonathan's thoughts remained anchored in the lobby below, in the calm presence of a man who had spoken only when necessary and returned to work without expectation. He walked toward his office, the polished floor reflecting the afternoon light stretching through the long windows. Inside, the city skyline shimmered beneath the bright midday sun, the glass towers standing silent and steady. Jonathan rested his hand lightly against the back of his chair before sitting, then glanced toward the stack of documents on his desk. The revised agreement waited for his review, but instead of reaching for it immediately, he looked out across the skyline again, considering the quiet lesson of the morning. Down in the lobby, Daniel Brooks continued moving along the glass panels, wiping away faint marks left by passing hands. The sunlight now filled the atrium, warming the marble floor and casting long reflections across the polished surfaces. Daniel worked methodically, folding each cloth after use, adjusting his cart, moving forward with the same steady rhythm that defined his presence. A few visitors passed by, barely noticing him, while the building continued its quiet motion around him. After finishing the last panel near the entrance, Daniel stepped back, checking the reflection. The glass shimmered with clean clarity, mirroring the bright afternoon sky beyond. He adjusted the cart handle and began guiding it toward the service corridor, his footsteps soft against the marble. Above, Jonathan finally opened the revised document, reading carefully, line by line, his attention sharper than before. The numbers were familiar, the language more precise, but his approach had changed. He paused occasionally, rereading sections, ensuring clarity, remembering how easily a single clause could alter the course of a decision. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the skyline, their shadows moving gently over the buildings. Downstairs, Daniel reached the service hallway and paused briefly near the narrow window where sunlight filtered in. He watched the light settle across the tiled wall, then returned to folding the cloth in his hand, the simple motion grounding and familiar. The afternoon moved quietly, each floor of the building continuing its rhythm, executives reviewing documents, visitors entering and leaving, custodians working unseen. Yet beneath the routine, something subtle remained, a quiet recognition that small voices could carry meaningful weight. As the day softened toward late afternoon, Daniel guided his cart back into the lobby once more, the sunlight now warmer, golden reflections stretching across the glass. He wiped one final panel near the entrance, then stepped back, the polished surface reflecting both the city beyond and his calm silhouette. Above, Jonathan Whitmore stood again near his office window, looking out across the same skyline, thoughtful but composed. Neither spoke, neither reached out again, yet the connection remained, quiet and steady, like the light stretching across the building. Daniel adjusted his cart and walked slowly toward the service corridor, his footsteps fading into the calm rhythm of the building, while sunlight lingered on the polished glass, leaving behind a silent reflection of a moment where humility met recognition and the quiet strength of one voice reshaped the course of a morning without ever needing to be raised.